I'm Ben Williams. My wife and I, Luann, own Wetland Preserve, LLC, which is a timber operation, most of which is in Putnam County in Florida. And we have planted stands and natural regeneration stands. We've been doing this about 16 years or so. And a good portion of our land is in conservation easements, probably 3,800 acres or so of it, so that it's protected for future generations and continues to feed wood into the forestry industry and provide jobs and, money to the state's economy. We bought this property a little over 16 years ago. We have about 5,000 acres between Putnam County and Bradford County. Most of it's in Putnam County. About 3,800 acres of it is in conservation easements, so it's permanently protected. And most of what we've got is slash pine and loblolly pine. We've got 300 or 400 acres of longleaf planted on the property. And the greatest proportion of it is planted. We do have 700 or 800 acres of natural regeneration. How did I discover Ponzi? Well, basically, going on and looking at heavy equipment. And I saw the Ponzi and I kept thinking, that is amazing. That's something we need to be using here that needs to be available in Florida. Because we have conservation values pretty high on our list of things that matter. How much more gentle it is on the land. Those things all appeal to us. The fact that there's no loading decks when they're finished. The fact that they can work, we have mostly wet flatwoods, the fact that they can work when it's wetter, so it expands the amount of time that the log crew can work. That's a big deal here. We'll give you some acres. Come do a demonstration, because we want log crews here in Northeast Florida to have this equipment, because that's what we want to happen on our property. And because you had equipment down there at the convention, ended up here, and it was incredibly interesting. No loading decks, less mess. It was so obvious, even though we'd seen it on the videos and heard everybody say how much less ground impact it had, how much less damage it did to the adjacent trees when you're doing a thinning. And you can look out in this stand now. If you'd seen this stand before the thinning, it was mostly pine straw underneath this thick canopy of trees. As soon as we opened it up, obviously the herbaceous vegetation comes back. Well, again, conservation easements and the values that are not always showing up on a balance sheet. We were talking a few minutes ago about chasing that last 0.1% of value. Well, for private landowners, and especially for non-governmental organizations, environmental organizations, the universities, maybe the military reservations, those things that don't show up as dollars, but show up as the intangibles, the way your woods look, the quality of what's out there. When you're done, those things really matter. And that open window, the equipment gives you a wider window to work. And I would mention one other thing is that we lease the land, all the land gets leased out to hunters. And the way the woods look allows us to request a little bit more from our hunters, not so much in the terms of money, but in terms of behavior, and so we look out for them. And with this kind of equipment and this kind of work, and especially when we get to a second thinning instead of a first thinning here in Florida, these guys they're thrilled to be here. They'll toe the lines, they'll act like second sets of eyes for us to keep trespassing and all that down. From the perspective of the landowner, and now we're talking about money, right? We're talking about getting the most out of a stand. Well, this stand is 16 years old, and typically you could not take that to the local chip and saw mills. They don't want it until it's 18 years old. They had a rep out here, obviously wanted to see how the equipment worked, but the crew was cutting 16 feet, 6 inch, I think it was, what they were, 16 feet, 6 inch sections out of the bases of these 16-year-old trees that they would not normally take to the mill. And they knew that they were perfectly straight. They knew that the equipment was making sure the measurements were absolutely right. They weren't going to get any surprises in the loads. And they were thrilled, and all right, we only produced 3 or 4 loads off of here, but they were thrilled to take them, and they made it very clear that having that kind of equipment, doing that kind of work, they would take chip and saw off of younger trees. That's a big deal. The other thing is we don't have piles at the landings. We have fewer damaged trees because there aren't as many trips with the equipment. There's not as many, skidder trips are, cut to a third because we're not using skidder. Your forwarder looks like it takes about 2.5 times as much as a skidder could carry at one time. All of those things from a landowner's perspective are important. Most of our land here is what we generally refer to as wet flatwoods, which means a lot of times it'll be inundated. And it'll be inundated because of thunderstorms or either tropical storms. So we have these windows to work in, and typically in Florida that window's, for what we have, the type of property we have, is going to be November through maybe the first week of June when the thunderstorms really get going. And there'll be windows in there where they have to close, right? Because we'll get a front that'll drop 3 or 4 inches and we have to stop the crews. Because you don't want your crews destroying your soil. But with this equipment, and with both the fact that it's lower ground pressure and the way they're using it, the way they're throwing the tops in the rows and the limb trimmings in the rows and going across the top of those, they open the window that they can harvest. And we've had years where we've had to pull crews off a site, and it might be 2 years before everything lined up where we could get them back to the site. Well, if that's a clear cut and they've clear cut 15 or 18 acres of a 30-acre site, you got those 15 or 18 acres not planted. But with this, because of that open window, you're going to have that happen less often, we think. And that's a big deal to us. All right, so I mentioned some of the intangibles that draw us to wanting this kind of equipment on our property. And I went through a fair number of them. One of them I didn't mention was, and you'll notice, maybe you can notice behind me, this is a 3rd row thinning. A lot of times the foresters will tell you, no, do a 5th row thinning, because if you do a 3rd row thinning, you're taking out 1/3 of your best trees. But yet what we've noticed in the past, and we do all 3rd row thinnings now, is that if you're going to do long rotation stand management, if you're going to do a 2nd and even a 3rd thinning, the difficulty of getting to those 4 rows with the traditional equipment ends up with more skinned trees at the butts. We find more dead trees in the woods after. It's not a lot, but it's some, right? And so we think, and we have not been able to do a full harvest, but to us it seems like we're going to end up with fewer trees dying after the fact, with the lower ground pressure, the lower impact on the soil, potentially, and we've had this happen in the past, when tropical storms come through, and we get a lot of them in Florida. This year we've had 3, actually 3 of them, all 3 hurricanes, where we had done thinnings 6 to 8 weeks, finished the thinning 6 to 8 weeks before these storms came through. And we lost another 10 to 15% of the trees because the ground had all been destabilized, and it's not just down the center of the rows, and it's getting into the other trees. And with your equipment, it looks like you're not going to have to get in amongst the other trees. So the trees are not going to get destabilized. So that's kind of a big thing to us, to not go out there and see after the fact damage, stuff left and, like that. My wife always says that we're only here a short time, and the things that we own, we don't really own. We simply get to be the stewards of them until the next humans come along, till the next generation comes along. And so that's always in the back of our minds, is how good can we leave this? That's part of going forward. How good is what we have going to be left for our children and our grandchildren? And so we think advancing the technology that we use in this industry is part of making that better.